Egypt appears in the Bible before Israel existed as a nation. That is not a minor detail. It is the center of everything. The biblical name for Egypt is Mizraim. It appears for the first time in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. Mizraim was the son of Ham, grandson of Noah. From him the Egyptian civilization descends directly, according to the scriptures. Ham was one of the 3 sons of Noah who survived the flood. His sons populated Africa and parts of the Mediterranean. Genesis chapter 10 describes this distribution with genealogical precision. The name Mizraim is a dual form in Hebrew. It literally means the 2 lands. That coincides exactly with the historical division of ancient Egypt between Upper and Lower Egypt. The Egyptians never called their land Egypt. They called it Kemet, which means black land. The Hebrews always knew it as Mizraim. That name persists to this day in modern Arabic as Misr. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 is the oldest known document that organizes the peoples of the world by family origin. There is nothing comparable in any other ancient culture. Mizraim had sons whose names are equally revealing. Genesis chapter 10 verses 13 and 14 lists them. Among them are Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Kasluhim, and Kaphtorim. From Kasluhim, according to verse 14, came the Philistines. This directly connects the most persistent enemies of Israel to the Egyptian lineage, a fact that few people associate. Kaphtorim is identified elsewhere in the Old Testament with Crete. Amos chapter 9 verse 7 mentions that the Philistines came from Kaphtor. Archaeology confirms Minoan influence on Philistine culture. The first recorded encounter between a Hebrew and Egypt involves Abraham. Genesis chapter 12 verse 10 describes how Abraham went down to Egypt because of a severe famine in Canaan. Abraham did not enter Egypt as an ordinary refugee. He entered with servants, livestock, and wealth. He was a man of considerable resources, according to the biblical text. In Egypt, Abraham asked Sarah to say she was his sister. Genesis chapter 12 verse 13 records this request. The reason was his fear of being killed on account of her beauty. Sarah was taken to the Pharaoh's palace. Genesis chapter 12 verse 15 confirms this. Pharaoh took her as his wife and treated Abraham well on her account. God intervened directly. Genesis chapter 12 verse 17 says that the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with great plagues. This occurred before the Exodus. It is the first time God uses plagues against Egypt in the scriptures. Pharaoh confronted Abraham. He asked him why he had deceived him. He expelled him from Egypt with all his possessions. Abraham left richer than when he had entered. From that encounter, Abraham brought back something more than gold. He brought back an Egyptian servant woman named Hagar. Genesis chapter 16 verse 1 presents her as the servant of Sarah. Her presence would change the history of the world. Hagar was the mother of Ishmael. Genesis chapter 16 verse 15 records it. From Ishmael descend the Arab peoples, according to biblical tradition, and the genealogy recorded in Genesis chapter 25. Egypt comes into contact with the people of God again through Joseph. Genesis chapter 37 verse 28 describes how Joseph was sold to Ishmaelite merchants for 20 pieces of silver. They took him to Egypt. The merchants sold Joseph to Potiphar. Genesis chapter 39 verse 1 identifies Potiphar as an official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. He was a man of considerable position in the Egyptian court. Joseph prospered in Potiphar's house. Genesis chapter 39 verse 2 says that the Lord was with Joseph. Potiphar put him in charge of everything he owned. Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph. Genesis chapter 39 verse 20 describes his imprisonment. Joseph was placed in the prison where the king's prisoners were kept. In prison, Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Genesis chapter 40 records both interpretations with precision. The cupbearer was restored, and the baker was executed, exactly as Joseph had predicted. 2 years later, Pharaoh had his own dreams. Genesis chapter 41 verse 1 describes them: 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, 7 full ears of grain and 7 withered ears. None of the wise men of Egypt could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Genesis chapter 41 verse 8 confirms it. The religious and magical system of Egypt was put to the test and failed. The cupbearer remembered Joseph. Genesis chapter 41 verse 12 describes him as a young Hebrew, a servant of the captain of the guard. He presented him before Pharaoh as an interpreter of dreams. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine over all the land. Genesis chapter 41 verses 25 through 31 record the full interpretation. Pharaoh recognized something extraordinary in Joseph. Genesis chapter 41 verse 38 asked his servants whether they could find anyone like Joseph, in whom was the Spirit of God. Joseph was appointed second in the kingdom of Egypt. Genesis chapter 41 verse 41 records the exact words of Pharaoh. Only Pharaoh would be above him. Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. Genesis chapter 41 verse 45 records it. He also gave him as a wife Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. On was the sacred city of the god Ra, the sun god. The Greeks called it Heliopolis, city of the sun. Joseph's marriage to the daughter of its priest represents the deepest integration of a Hebrew into the Egyptian religious elite. Joseph was 30 years old when he began his service before Pharaoh. Genesis chapter 41 verse 46 confirms his exact age. He had spent more than a decade between slavery and prison. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph accumulated grain. Genesis chapter 41 verse 49 says that the grain was like the sand of the sea. There was so much that they stopped keeping count. When the famine came, it affected all the surrounding nations. Genesis chapter 41 verse 57 says that all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. Egypt became the center of the known world. The famine also reached Canaan. Jacob sent his 10 older sons to Egypt to buy grain. Genesis chapter 42 verse 1 records his decision. He kept Benjamin, the youngest, behind. Joseph's brothers bowed before him with their faces to the ground. Genesis chapter 42 verse 6 describes it. Without knowing it, they were fulfilling the dream Joseph had dreamed 22 years before. Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize him. Genesis chapter 42 verse 8 confirms it. The man they had sold as a slave now held power over their lives. After a series of tests, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. Genesis chapter 45 verse 3 records his words. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? His brothers could not answer him. Terror had paralyzed them. Joseph recognized divine providence in everything. Genesis chapter 45 verse 8 contains one of the most powerful theological declarations in Genesis. It was not you who sent me here, but God. Pharaoh learned of the reunion and acted. Genesis chapter 45, verse 17, records that Pharaoh ordered Joseph to bring his entire family to Egypt. He would give them the best of the land. Jacob and all his family descended to Egypt. Genesis chapter 46 verse 27 specifies the exact number. 70 people in total were those who entered Egypt with Jacob. The number 70 is theologically significant. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 22, this detail is recalled with precision. 70 people who would become a nation of millions. Pharaoh assigned the land of Goshen to Jacob's family. Genesis chapter 47 verse 6 describes it as the best of the land of Egypt. Goshen was in the Nile Delta, fertile and abundant land. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Genesis chapter 47 verse 7 records this unusual moment. The patriarch of God's people pronounced a blessing upon the most powerful ruler of the known world. Pharaoh asked Jacob how old he was. Jacob responded in Genesis chapter 47 verse 9 that his years of pilgrimage had been 130, and he added that they had been few and difficult. Jacob lived 17 more years in Egypt. Genesis chapter 47 verse 28 confirms this detail. He died at the age of 147. Before dying, Jacob blessed each of his 12 sons. Genesis chapter 49 records each blessing in detail. These prophetic words trace the destiny of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob also blessed the 2 sons of Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh were adopted as Jacob's own sons. Genesis chapter 48 verse 5 records this formal adoption. That is why Israel actually has 13 tribes. Jacob specifically asked not to be buried in Egypt. Genesis chapter 49 verse 29 expresses his request. He wanted to be buried in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, alongside Abraham and Isaac. His funeral was extraordinary. Genesis chapter 50 verse 3 says that the Egyptians mourned him 70 days. The same mourning period the Egyptians reserved for their own pharaohs. Joseph carried his father's body to Canaan with an enormous procession. Genesis chapter 50 verse 9 describes chariots, horsemen, and a very great company. It was a state procession organized by the power of Egypt. The Canaanites, who saw the procession, called it Abel Mizraim. Genesis chapter 50 verse 11 records that name. It means the mourning of the Egyptians. They interpreted the grief as belonging to Egypt, not to Israel. Joseph also asked that his bones be carried out of Egypt when God visited his people. Genesis chapter 50 verse 25 contains his solemn oath. He had faith in a promise he would not see fulfilled in his lifetime. Exodus chapter 13 verse 19 confirms that Moses took the bones of Joseph when leaving Egypt. 400 years later, the request was honored. The generational faithfulness to the biblical oath has no equivalent in ancient history. The book of Genesis ends in Egypt. The final verse, chapter 50 verse 26, describes the embalming of Joseph and his placement in a coffin in Egypt. The nation of God does not yet exist. It is in gestation within the womb of the most powerful civilization on earth. Egypt was not merely the setting of slavery. It was the furnace where God forged a people. The book of Exodus chapter 1 verse 7 says that the children of Israel were fruitful and multiplied. They became so numerous that they filled the land. A new Pharaoh rose to power. Exodus chapter 1 verse 8 says that this Pharaoh did not know Joseph. With him began the oppression. With him also began the path toward the most dramatic liberation in sacred history. The identity of that Pharaoh has generated debate among historians and theologians for centuries. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 says that the Exodus occurred 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple. That detail fixes the date of the Exodus at around 1446 before Christ. If that chronology is correct, the pharaoh of the oppression would be Thutmose I or Thutmose II. The pharaoh of the Exodus would be Amenhotep II. The archaeology of the period is consistent with a sudden depopulation in the region of Goshen. Genesis chapter 15 verses 13 and 14 contains God's direct prophecy to Abraham. Your descendants will dwell in a foreign land. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Afterward, they will come out with great wealth. That prophecy was declared before Isaac was born, before Jacob, before Joseph, before the slavery. God announced Egypt 4 centuries in advance. That is not a historical detail. It is divine sovereignty, invisible action. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 says that the time the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Every year of slavery was within the plan revealed to Abraham. The impact of Egypt on Israel goes beyond slavery. The Mosaic Law makes constant reference to the Egyptian experience. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34 commands love for the foreigner. The reason given is direct. You were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Egypt also appears as a constant temptation for Israel. Numbers chapter 11, verse 5 records the complaint of the people. They remembered the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic of Egypt. The prosperity of slavery seduced entire generations. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 2 warns against seeking refuge in Egypt. The prophet uses the ancient name shade of Egypt as a synonym for false protection. Egypt, in biblical prophecy, represents trust in human power rather than the power of God. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 contains a phrase that the New Testament applies directly to Christ. Out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew chapter 2, verse 15 cites that verse to explain the flight of Jesus' family to Egypt and their return. Jesus was in Egypt. Matthew chapter 2, verse 14 records that Joseph, Mary, and the child fled to Egypt to escape Herod. The nation that had enslaved the people of God became a refuge for the Savior of that people. The circle closes in a way that no human writer could have designed. Abraham went down to Egypt. Israel was born in Egypt. The Messiah took refuge in Egypt. Each stage was announced. Each stage fulfills a prior promise. Revelation chapter 11, verse 8 uses the name Egypt as a prophetic symbol. The great city where the world would celebrate the death of the two witnesses is called symbolically Sodom and Egypt, two names that in the scriptures represent rebellion and oppression against God. From Genesis to Revelation, Egypt never disappears. It is a shadow that runs through the entire biblical narrative. It began with the son of Ham. It will end in the final prophecy, and at the center of that entire arc stands the people God promised to form, to liberate, and to redeem. The story of Egypt in the Bible is not a geographical accident. It is divine architecture with purpose from the very beginning. Ham was the father of Mizraim. Genesis chapter 10, verse 6 establishes it without ambiguity. Mizraim is the Hebrew name for Egypt, used more than 600 times in the Old Testament. But Ham had received a curse. Genesis chapter 9, verse 25 records the words of Noah, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves, shall he be to his brothers." The most powerful nation of antiquity descended from that line. Egypt does not appear in the Bible as a backdrop. It appears as an actor. It has an active role in every stage of the history of salvation. The first mention of Egypt as a nation occurs in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Abraham went down to Egypt because of the famine, not by spiritual choice, by physical necessity. In Egypt, Abraham lied about Sarah. Genesis chapter 12, verse 13 records that he told them she was his sister. The patriarch of faith stumbled in the most sophisticated nation of his time. Pharaoh took Sarah into his house. Genesis chapter 12, verse 15 confirms it. God had to intervene with plagues to free Abraham's wife. The pattern of plagues appears here for the first time, centuries before the Exodus. Abraham left Egypt with riches. Genesis chapter 13, verse 2 mentions silver, gold, and livestock. But he also left with Hagar. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1 identifies her as Egyptian. That woman would change the course of the history of nations. Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. Genesis chapter 16 verse 15 records it. From Ishmael would descend 12 princes. Genesis chapter 17 verse 20 confirms it. The Arab world has direct roots in that Egyptian slave woman whom Abraham brought back from his first descent to the Nile. Joseph arrived in Egypt in chains. Genesis chapter 37 verse 28 records that he was sold to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. Those merchants took him precisely to the nation where everything had been prepared for him. Potiphar was an official of Pharaoh. Genesis chapter 39 verse 1 identifies him as captain of the guard. Joseph entered the house of the man most connected to the power of Egypt, not by chance, by providence. Joseph's prison was also within Pharaoh's system. Genesis chapter 40 verse 3 mentions the prison of the house of the captain of the guard. Joseph never left the circle of power, even though he was in chains. Joseph interpreted dreams with a clear source. Genesis chapter 40 verse 8 records his declaration, "Interpretations belong to God." That phrase opened the path to the throne of Egypt for him. Pharaoh recognized in Joseph something that his own wise men did not have. Genesis chapter 41 verse 38 expresses it directly. Can we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God? The pagan ruler saw what many believers failed to see in their own brothers. Joseph received an Egyptian name. Genesis chapter 41 verse 45 records that Pharaoh called him Zaphanath-Paneah. He also gave him as a wife Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest. Joseph integrated himself into the nation more deeply than any Israelite would do afterward. The 7 years of abundance arrived exactly as Joseph had predicted. Genesis chapter 41 verse 47 confirms it. The land produced abundantly. Joseph stored grain like the sand of the sea. There was so much that they stopped counting. The famine struck all the nations. Genesis chapter 41 verse 57 records that from all the earth they came to Egypt to buy grain. Israel in Canaan also felt the famine, and Jacob sent his sons to the only nation with reserves. Joseph's brothers arrived and bowed down before him. Genesis chapter 42 verse 6 records it. They bowed with their faces to the ground. The dream they had tried to destroy by selling him had been fulfilled before their very eyes. Joseph recognized them. They did not recognize him. Genesis chapter 42 verse 8 confirms it. 22 years of distance, an Egyptian name, and the robes of a governor had erased the brother they remembered. The test Joseph applied to them lasted months. Genesis chapter 44 records the plan with Benjamin and the silver cup. Joseph did not act out of revenge. He acted to see whether his brothers had changed. Mercy requires evidence before it can restore. Judah was the one who spoke on behalf of all of them. Genesis chapter 44 verse 18 records his speech before Joseph. The same Judah who had proposed selling Joseph now offered his own life for Benjamin. The change was real. Joseph could no longer contain himself. Genesis chapter 45 verse 1 records the exact moment. He had all the Egyptians leave, only he and his brothers remained, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it from outside. His words in that moment are pure theology. Genesis chapter 45 verses 5 through 8 contain the declaration, "It was not you who sold me here, but God." God had turned betrayal into an instrument of salvation. Jacob descended to Egypt with 70 people. Genesis chapter 46 verse 27 gives the exact number, 70 souls, an entire family. But Egypt would turn them into a nation. Goshen was the territory they received. Genesis chapter 47 verse 11 records it. It was the most fertile zone of the Nile Delta. Pharaoh himself assigned it to them in honor of Joseph. Israel began in Egypt with privilege, not with slavery. Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt. Genesis chapter 47 verse 28 confirms it. He died at 147 years of age. He asked one single favor, that he not be buried in Egypt. Genesis chapter 47 verse 29 records his oath. Joseph promised to fulfill it, and he fulfilled it. Genesis chapter 50 verse 13 records that his sons carried Jacob to Canaan and buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Egypt kept Jacob's embalmed body, preserved during the journey, but the promised land received him. Joseph himself gave instructions about his bones. Genesis chapter 50 verse 25 records his command. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. He did not want to remain in Egypt forever. He knew that nation was not the final destination. 430 years later, that promise was fulfilled. Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, records that Moses took the bones of Joseph when leaving Egypt. Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, confirms they were buried in Shechem. God's faithfulness has no expiration date. It has a date of fulfillment, and that date always arrives. Genesis ends with a coffin in Egypt. Genesis chapter 50 verse 26 records it without hesitation. Joseph died at 110 years of age. His body was embalmed, according to Egyptian custom, but his instructions pointed to another land. That coffin was not an ending. It was a declaration of faith. Joseph died believing that God would move his people back to Canaan. He would not see it, but he affirmed it with an oath before his brothers. The 110 years of Joseph carry specific cultural weight. In ancient Egypt, 110 years represented the perfect life of the wise and righteous man. Egyptian texts of the second millennium before Christ document this. The age of Joseph is not a casual detail. Joseph governed Egypt for decades under the title of vizier. The archaeological records of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom document Semitic viziers with total authority over the kingdom. The opposition existed. The historical context is solid. The Hebrew text uses the word Zaphenath Paneah for the name Pharaoh gave to Joseph. Genesis chapter 41 verse 45 records it. Egyptologists have identified phonetic equivalents in texts of the second millennium before Christ. The name fits the period. Joseph also received Asenath as his wife. She was the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. On was Heliopolis, the center of Egyptian solar worship. Joseph married into the religious elite of Egypt. That confirms the depth of his integration into power. From that union were born Manasseh and Ephraim. Genesis chapter 41 verses 51 and 52 records the names and their meaning. Manasseh means God has made me forget all my hardship. Ephraim means God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Jacob blessed those two sons of Joseph before he died. Genesis chapter 48 verses 13 through 19 records the scene. He crossed his hands deliberately. He placed his right hand on Ephraim, the younger. Joseph tried to correct him. Jacob held firm. That reversed blessing has measurable historical consequences. Ephraim became the dominant tribe of the northern kingdom of Israel. The prophets used the name Ephraim as a synonym for all of Israel. First blessing, first place. Jacob knew. The 12 tribes do not include Joseph as a direct tribe. They include Manasseh and Ephraim in his place. Genesis chapter 48 verse 5 records the formal adoption. Jacob elevated the sons of Joseph to the level of his own sons. Joseph received a double portion in the promised land. Judah received a different blessing. Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 10, contains the central prophecy of the chapter. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Rabbis and early Christian interpreters identified Shiloh with the Messiah. That prophecy, in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, is one of the most cited in the Old Testament. Matthew, Luke, and John construct genealogies that trace Jesus directly to Judah. The thread begins in the blessing of a dying patriarch. Reuben lost his birthright. Genesis chapter 49 verse 4 explains the reason. He went up to his father's bed. 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 1 confirms that his right was transferred to the sons of Joseph. The consequences of actions cross generations. Simeon and Levi also received a rebuke. Genesis chapter 49 verses 5 through 7 recalls the massacre at Shechem. They would be scattered in Israel. Simeon ended up absorbed within the territory of Judah. Levi received no land, only scattered cities among the other tribes. That scattering of Levi had unexpected consequences. Without land of their own, the Levites depended entirely on God and on the offerings of the people. Their separation from territory was the mechanism that made them permanent servants of the tabernacle and the temple. Genesis closes with death, embalming, and promise. Three elements that point forward: the death of Jacob, the death of Joseph, and the oath over the bones. The entire book ends looking toward something that has not yet arrived. Genesis begins with God creating the heavens and the earth. It ends with a coffin inside a foreign nation. Between those 2 points lies the fall, the flood, the dispersion, the choosing of Abraham, the covenant, the promise, the testing, and the providence. No book of the Bible covers more theological ground in fewer pages. 50 chapters that establish the foundations of everything that follows. Without Genesis, Exodus makes no sense. Without Exodus, Sinai has no context. Without Sinai, the rest of the scriptures loses its anchor. The promise made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, has not yet been completely fulfilled by the end of the book. The land remains a promise. The nation remains 70 people. The blessing to all the families of the earth is still waiting. But God has forgotten nothing. Every name recorded, every number given, every oath pronounced in Genesis has an answer somewhere else in the scriptures. The Bible has no loose ends, only threads waiting for the exact moment to be completed. Joseph died at 110 years. That age is not arbitrary. In Egyptian culture, 110 years represented the perfect life, the highest divine blessing. Ancient Egyptian texts of the 2nd millennium before Christ document it. The age of Joseph is not a casual detail. Before dying, Joseph made his brothers swear an oath. He did not ask for riches for his descendants. He did not ask for position or honor. He asked that his bones be taken out of Egypt. Genesis chapter 50 verse 25 records it with precision. That oath took generations to fulfill. Exodus chapter 13 verse 19 confirms that Moses carried the bones of Joseph out of the country. The promise traveled 400 years inside a box before it was honored. The 70 who went down to Egypt with Jacob became a nation of millions. Exodus chapter 1 verse 7 describes that multiplication with words nearly identical to Genesis chapter 1. They were fruitful, they multiplied, they filled the land. The language of creation reappears within Egypt. God did not begin something new with Israel. He continued what he had initiated at the beginning. The promise to Abraham was a second creation in motion. Genesis never names any pharaoh by his personal name. This is not an oversight in the text. It is deliberate theological precision. Human power receives no permanent identity. Only God and his chosen ones carry names that endure. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, 4 generations. Each one received the same promise in greater detail. What was said to Abraham in general terms by the time of Joseph was already taking visible shape within history. The book ends with the word coffin in Hebrew, Aaron. That same word is used later for the Ark of the Covenant. The coffin of Joseph and the ark that would contain the law share the same root in the original language. The connection is not accidental. Inside the coffin were the bones of the man who forgave his brothers. Inside the ark would be the law that Israel would repeatedly break. Two boxes, two realities, both pointing toward a redemption that Genesis does not finish seeing, but that is already in motion. Genesis closes with a dead man inside a box in a foreign land. But that is not defeat. It is suspended promise, waiting for its exact moment. 400 years later, that box was still there. No one had buried it. No one had forgotten it. Israel carried the bones of Joseph through the wilderness for 40 years. Joshua chapter 24 verse 32 records where those bones ended up. They were buried in Shechem, exactly on the land that Jacob had purchased in Genesis chapter 33 verse 19. The land Jacob paid for returned to Jacob's hands through the bones of his son. The promise was not lost. It only traveled through time with the precision of God. Shechem is not a minor detail. It was the first city Abraham set foot in within Canaan. Genesis chapter 12 verse 6 records it. The first altar Abraham built was there. The bones of Joseph came to rest in the very soil where Abraham had first received the promise of the land. The circle closed with surgical precision. Genesis builds an invisible architecture. Every name, every land purchase, every oath, every count of years has a destination the reader cannot yet see. Abraham left Ur without knowing where he was going. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 confirms it. But God already knew where his great-grandson's bones would end up. That defines the nature of the God of Genesis. He does not improvise. He does not react. He builds toward a point that already exists before man takes his first step. Jacob went down to Egypt thinking he would die in a foreign land. God spoke to him in Genesis chapter 46 verses 3 and 4. He promised that he himself would bring him back up again. Up again. That verb in Hebrew is Allah, the same verb that describes offerings that ascend to the altar. The departure from Egypt already carried the language of offering before it began. Israel in Egypt was not a trapped nation. It was an offering being prepared. The fire that would consume it would be called the Exodus. The 400 years of oppression did not surprise God. Genesis chapter 15 verse 13 announced them with precision to Abraham. 400 years of affliction followed by judgment upon the nation that had enslaved them. Abraham received the complete calendar of his descendants' suffering before Isaac was born. That changes the way every page of Genesis is read. Every story of pain within the book takes place within an already declared plan. The slavery of Joseph, the famine, the descent to Egypt. Nothing was an accident. Genesis ends but does not conclude. It is the first chapter of a story that runs through 65 more books. The seeds planted in Eden do not finish growing until the revelation. The serpent of Genesis chapter 3 reappears in Revelation chapter 12. The promise of the seed that would crush its head continues its course through all of Scripture. The tree of life closed off in Genesis chapter 3 verse 24 opens again in Revelation chapter 22 verse 2. The same tree, the same fruit, now for all nations. What Adam lost, the second Adam restores. Paul uses exactly that comparison in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 45. Genesis requires the New Testament to be fully understood, and the New Testament makes no sense without Genesis. The two ends of the Bible hold each other up with the precision of a stone arch. The book of beginnings does not speak only of the past, it speaks of the origin of everything that is still in motion. Every promise made to Abraham remains active. Every word spoken over the seed is still advancing. The coffin of Joseph waited 400 years. The promises of God have no expiration date. They have a date of fulfillment. And that date always arrives. Moses took the bones of Joseph out of Egypt. Exodus chapter 13 verse 19 records it with precision. A promise made 4 centuries earlier was not left buried. Joseph had instructed his brothers before dying. Genesis chapter 50 verses 24 and 25. He swore that God would visit them. He demanded that they carry his bones when they departed. That oath crossed generations of slavery. No pharaoh could erase it. No chain could silence it. The words of the patriarchs carry physical weight. Israel carried those bones through 40 years of wilderness. They crossed the Red Sea with them. They marched around Jericho with them. The past is not abandoned. It is carried. Joshua chapter 24 verse 32 records the final burial. The bones of Joseph came to rest in Shechem, exactly on the land that Jacob had purchased. Genesis chapter 33 verse 19. Genesis purchased land that Exodus reclaimed. The transactions of the Book of Beginnings have consequences that last for centuries. Nothing was symbolic. Everything was literal. Shechem was not chosen at random. Abraham had pitched his first tent there. Genesis chapter 12 verse 6. The promised land began exactly where the story of Joseph would end. Genesis draws circles that other books close. Every name, every city, every promise returns. Scripture wastes no words. Every detail is placed with intention. God presented himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. Exodus chapter 3 verse 6. Not as the God of the present only, as the God of a covenant initiated generations before. Jesus cited that verse before the Sadducees. Matthew chapter 22 verse 32. He used it to prove the resurrection. Genesis contains theological arguments that the New Testament is still unfolding. The promise made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 verses 2 and 3 included all the families of the earth. Not only Israel. Paul explains this in Galatians chapter 3 verse 8. He calls it the gospel announced beforehand. The gospel did not begin in Bethlehem. It began in Ur of the Chaldeans, when God called a man without an heir and promised him entire nations. Genesis is not religious prehistory. It is the founding document of everything God would do afterward. Every subsequent covenant has roots in its pages. Sinai points back to Abraham. The throne of David points back to Judah. The cross points back to the seed. Genesis chapter 49 verse 10 announced that the scepter would not depart from Judah until Shiloh came. Rabbinic interpreters understood Shiloh as a reference to the Messiah. The lineage of David fulfilled that word. The book ends with a coffin in Egypt. But that image is not defeat. It is a pause, like a seed beneath the earth. What appears to be death is preparation. Israel descended to Egypt as 70 people. Genesis chapter 46 verse 27. It departed as a multitude that darkened the horizon. The oppression did not reduce the people, it multiplied them. Exodus chapter 1 verse 12 says it plainly. The more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied. Pharaoh's plan produced exactly the opposite of what it sought. That pattern runs through all of Scripture. Every attempt to destroy the seed always strengthens it. Herod killed children in Bethlehem. He did not reach the one he was seeking. Genesis established that pattern from the beginning. Cain killed Abel, but God raised up Seth. Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. The line of promise cannot be extinguished by human hands. That is not optimism. It is repeated historical record. Genesis is the book of beginnings, but it is also the book of failed attempts to stop God. Every antagonist within its pages failed. Every promise survived. The entire Bible can be read as the story of that impossible resistance. No one has been able to shut what God opened in the first chapter. Not sin, not death, not time. The beginning is still in motion. The serpent believed it had won in the garden. It had not won. It had only begun its own countdown. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 contains the first verdict of defeat, directed against the enemy, pronounced by God himself, before Adam left the garden. That promise traveled through all of biblical history without losing momentum. Noah inherited it without knowing it. Abraham received it with a name and coordinates. Moses saw it reflected in the bronze serpent. John chapter 3 verse 14. The bronze serpent was not an invented symbol. It was a divine instruction. Numbers chapter 21 verse 8. Whoever looked at it lived. Jesus himself used that image to describe his own death. Every type in Genesis points forward, not as metaphor, as a premeditated sign. God designed the events to be readable from the future. Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice. Genesis chapter 22 verse 6. Christ carried his own cross. John chapter 19 verse 17. The distance between those two scenes is more than 2,000 years. The structure is identical. Abraham told Isaac that God would provide the lamb. Genesis chapter 22 verse 8. That phrase was not consolation, it was prophecy. John chapter 1 verse 29 fulfilled it with a name and a date. The mountain Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac, is identified by scholars with the mountain where Solomon's temple was later built. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. It was not geographical coincidence, it was design. Joseph was sold by his brothers for 20 pieces of silver. Genesis chapter 37 verse 28. Joseph was sold for 30 pieces. Matthew chapter 26 verse 15. Both were handed over by their own. Both ended up saving those who had betrayed them. Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50 verse 20 something that no offended man would say naturally. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. That phrase is pure theology, not sentimentalism. Joseph's brothers fell prostrate before him in Egypt. Genesis chapter 42 verse 6. Joseph had dreamed that decades before. Genesis chapter 37 verse 7. The dreams of God do not expire, they only mature. The book of Genesis contains 7 implicit or explicit covenants, according to the structure of the Hebrew text. Each one broadens the scope of the previous one. None cancels the one that preceded it. Paul understood this with precision. In Galatians chapter 3 verse 17, he wrote that the law, 430 years later, could not annul the covenant already confirmed by God. Sinai did not replace Abraham, it complemented him. Genesis established the vocabulary that all of Scripture would use afterward. Seed, covenant, blessing, land, nations. Without that vocabulary, Revelation cannot be read correctly. Revelation chapter 22 verse 2 speaks of the tree of life. That tree first appeared in Genesis chapter 2 verse 9. Scripture does not abandon its images, it completes them. The river that flowed out of Eden will water the final city. Revelation chapter 22 verse 1. What was cut off in the garden will be restored in the New Jerusalem. The Bible is an arch. Genesis is where that arch begins. Adam lost access to the tree. Genesis chapter 3 verse 24. Redeemed humanity will recover it forever. Revelation chapter 2 verse 7 already announces it as an active promise. That movement of loss and restoration is not accidental. It is architecture. God constructed history with beginning, development, and resolution. Genesis is the first word. The last is still being spoken. And whoever reads it with attention feels it. Every name, every figure, every genealogy that seemed irrelevant. Everything was calculated. Nothing is excess in the oldest and most living text that exists. The beginning is still the beginning, because what God started, only God closes. The question many dare not ask is this: Did Genesis really end? The final verse of Genesis describes Joseph in a coffin in Egypt. Genesis chapter 50 verse 26. But his bones were waiting. Exodus chapter 13 verse 19 records that Moses took them along when leaving. Joseph had commanded it explicitly. Genesis chapter 50 verse 25. A dead patriarch continued to be an active part of the Exodus. That says something about how God handles time. Stories do not close when the characters die. They close when the purpose is fulfilled. Joshua chapter 24 verse 32 confirms that the bones of Joseph were finally buried in Shechem, the same land that Jacob had purchased. Genesis chapter 33 verse 19. God remembered a promise made 4 generations before and fulfilled it with geographical precision. That is not narrative coincidence, it is documented faithfulness. The name Shechem is not minor. There Abraham received the first promise of the land. Genesis chapter 12 verse 6. There Jacob purchased soil. There Joseph was buried. The same place runs through centuries of sacred history. God works at the same points on the map. Genesis also established the pattern of the reversed firstborn. Abel over Cain, Seth over the other sons, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Ephraim over Manasseh. Genesis chapter 48 verse 19. God chooses according to his purpose, not according to human order. Paul cites this directly in Romans chapter 9 verses 11 through 13. That pattern does not end in Genesis. It continues. David was the youngest of 8 brothers. 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 11. The same principle operates centuries later. Genesis does not merely narrate, it programs. There is a Hebrew word that appears in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 and does not appear the same way again until the end of the canon. Tohu, chaos, emptiness, desolation. Isaiah chapter 34 verse 11 uses it to describe divine judgment upon the nations. Jeremiah chapter 4 verse 23 uses it when he sees the land devastated. The vocabulary of the beginning describes the end of the broken order. What existed before creation returns when humanity rejects the Creator. That is not poetry, it is structural theology. Genesis chapter 1 records that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters of chaos. Verse 2, where there is spirit, there is order. Where there is no spirit, chaos returns. The entire history can be read with that key. The Hebrew word for firmament, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 6, is rakia. It means expanse, separated space. The Greek translators used stereoma, something solid and firm. That difference in translation generated centuries of cosmological debate. The original Hebrew text does not assert a solid vault, it describes a functional separation. Genesis has been misinterpreted more often by poor translations than by lack of faith. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans. Genesis chapter 11 verse 31. Archaeologists have extensively excavated Ur. It was a city with cuneiform writing, stepped temples called ziggurats, and documented international trade. Abraham did not leave a primitive village. He left one of the most advanced cities of his time. God called someone who had everything. That changes what it means to obey. The ziggurat of Ur has direct parallels with the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 describes a tower whose top would reach the heavens. Mesopotamian ziggurats were exactly that. Religious structures designed to bring the human closer to the divine by their own force. Babel was not an engineering project. It was a theological declaration of independence. God responded not with destruction, but with dispersion. Genesis chapter 11 verse 8. He frustrated the project without eliminating the builders. That distinction matters. Divine judgment in Genesis almost always preserves something. The ark preserved, the dispersion preserved, The expulsion from Eden, preserved. God judges without annihilating what can still be redeemed. Genesis records 10 generations from Adam to Noah, Genesis chapter 5, and 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, Genesis chapter 11. That symmetry is not accidental. The Hebrew text uses parallel structures to signal points of divine turning. Each cycle of 10 generations ends with someone who changes history. Noah, Abraham. The number 10 in ancient Hebrew signals the completeness of a cycle. The extreme ages of the antediluvian patriarchs are not myth. They are a serious textual problem that scholars continue to debate. Methuselah lived 969 years. Genesis chapter 5, verse 27. The Sumerian king list tablets record pre-Diluvian kings with reigns of thousands of years. The two traditions, Hebrew and Sumerian, agree that longevity decreased after the flood. That does not prove the Bible on its own, but it eliminates the idea that it is an isolated story with no historical parallels. After the flood, the ages fall systematically. Shem lived 600 years. Genesis chapter 11, verse 10. Arphaxad, 438. Serug, 230. Abraham, 175. Moses, 120. The reduction is progressive and documented verse by verse. Genesis records that decline with statistical precision. It does not explain it. It only documents it. There is something in Genesis that modern readers frequently overlook. The named women: Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah, Tamar, Hagar. In the ancient world, women rarely appeared in genealogies or historical records. Genesis names them, quotes them, includes them in the covenants. Hagar received a direct promise from God. Genesis chapter 16, verse 10. Not through Abraham, directly. That is theologically extraordinary for any text of the second millennium before Christ. Tamar appears in the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. Genesis introduced someone whom God would not forget. 1,000 years later, her name was still in the sacred record. Genesis is the book where God establishes who matters, and his list always surprises. There is a detail in Genesis chapter 2 that almost no one stops to examine. God plants a garden. He does not build a city. He does not establish a throne. He plants. The Hebrew verb is nata. It appears in concrete agricultural contexts throughout the Old Testament. Eden is not a decorative metaphor. It has geographical coordinates. Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. 4 rivers define it: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates. 2 of those rivers still exist today in the same location. Archaeologists have identified the region of the Tigris and Euphrates with ancient Mesopotamia, the same zone where the first known civilizations arose. That is not casual coincidence. The text also names the land of Havilah, where there is gold. Genesis chapter 2, verse 11. It adds that this gold is good. It is a geographical detail with real economic value. It is not symbolic language. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17 introduces the first divine prohibition recorded in the scriptures. It is not a complex moral law. It is a single instruction about a single tree. The simplicity is deliberate. The serpent of chapter 3 does not appear without theological antecedent. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 17, describes an exalted being who fell through pride. John chapter 8, verse 44, calls him a liar from the beginning. Genesis opens the file. The rest of the Bible closes it. The deception in the garden has a precise structure. First, it distorts the Word of God. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Then, it contradicts it directly. Verse 4. Then it offers a half-truth. Verse 5. It is a 3-step sequence that repeats itself throughout all biblical history of temptation. When Adam and Eve hide, God asks something he already knows. Genesis chapter 3 verse 9. Where are you? It is not divine ignorance. It is an invitation to acknowledgement. The Hebrew uses a form of question that implies expectation of a response. The first death in Genesis is not carried out by a human being. It is performed by God. Genesis chapter 3 verse 21. He kills an animal to clothe Adam and Eve. It is the first sacrifice recorded in the scriptures. The pattern of substitution appears as early as chapter 3. Cain and Abel are not simply two brothers in conflict. They represent two ways of approaching God. Abel brings from the firstborn of his flock. Genesis chapter 4 verse 4. Cain brings from the fruit of the ground, with no specification of quality or first fruits. The text is exact in that detail. God accepts Abel's offering. He does not explain why at that moment. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4 does so thousands of years later. Abel offered in faith. The reason was in the disposition, not only in the object. Cain receives a sign from God after his punishment. Genesis chapter 4 verse 15. That sign protects him. The same God who judges him marks him to preserve him. It is a theological tension that the text does not resolve with words. It only records it. The line of Cain produces the first city. Genesis chapter 4 verse 17. The first music. The first metalworking. Genesis chapter 4 verses 20 through 22. Cultural progress arises in the line of the murderer. Genesis does not condemn it or celebrate it. It only documents it. Seth is the third son of Adam, but the text presents him as a specific replacement. Genesis chapter 4 verse 25. Eve herself says it. God has appointed for me another offspring in place of Abel. The language of substitution appears again. In the line of Seth, something happens that the text signals without elaborating. Genesis chapter 4 verse 26. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. The Hebrew verb kara in that form implies public proclamation, not private worship. Something collective began with Seth. Enoch is the seventh patriarch from Adam in the line of Seth. The number 7 in ancient Hebrew marks sacred completeness. He did not experience a recorded death. Genesis chapter 5 verse 24. He walked with God and disappeared because God took him. The Hebrew verb laka indicates an active removal. Jude verse 14 cites a prophecy of Enoch about the final divine judgment. That means there was oral or written tradition attributed to Enoch that the New Testament recognizes as valid. Genesis introduces him briefly, but his theological weight extends to the last book of the canon. Methuselah is the man who lived the most years according to the Bible, 969 years. Genesis chapter 5, verse 27. His name in ancient Hebrew has been interpreted as, when he dies, it will come. He died in the year of the flood, according to the genealogical calculations of the text. The chronological coincidence is exact. Noah is born in the 10th generation from Adam in the line of Seth. Genesis chapter 5, verse 29. His father Lamech names him with a specific expectation. This one will comfort us in our work and in the toil of our hands. The name Noah derives from the Hebrew nuach, which means rest or relief. Before the flood, the text introduces an unprecedented disturbance. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The sons of God took wives from among the daughters of men. The identity of those sons of God has divided theological interpretation for centuries. Text does not define them. It only records what they did. The result of those unions were the Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. The Hebrew term derives from naphal, which means to fall or to bring down. The Nephilim existed before those unions and also after. The text specifies it. They are not an exclusive product of them. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33 mentions them again. The Israelite spies encounter them in Canaan, centuries after the flood. They describe themselves as grasshoppers before them. The scale of the account is not poetic. It is a military reconnaissance report. God evaluates the situation before the flood with a direct statement. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. He saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. The Hebrew term rabbah indicates extreme abundance, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The word continually is kol hayom, all day long, without pause. God's response to that includes a startling detail. Genesis chapter 6, verse 6. He regretted making man. The Hebrew verb naham implies a change of course with deep grief. Numbers chapter 23, verse 19 says that God is not a man, that he should repent. The tension between both texts is real. Theologians call it anthropopathism. Noah receives a very specific technical instruction. Genesis chapter 6, verse 14. Gopher wood. The term gopher appears only once in the entire Bible. There is no consensus on what species it was. Some researchers propose cypress, others laminated cedar. The text does not clarify. The ark had precise dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. Genesis chapter 6, verse 15. A standard Hebrew cubit is approximately 45 centimeters. That gives a vessel of more than 130 meters in length. The length-to-width ratio is similar to modern high-stability cargo ships. Danish naval engineer Lars Lindberg Christensen analyzed those proportions in modern studies. He concluded that they are optimal for withstanding extreme waves without propulsion. The biblical text records them without technical justification, only as direct divine instruction. God established a covenant with Noah before the rain began. Genesis chapter 6, verse 18. It is the first time the word covenant, berit in Hebrew, appears in the Bible. It is not a vague promise. It is a legal structure with conditions and guarantees. Genesis introduces the concept in the context of imminent destruction. Noah was to bring animals into the ark in a very specific order. Genesis chapter 7, verse 2. 7 pairs of each clean animal, 1 pair of each unclean animal. This distinction between clean and unclean appears before the law of Moses. It precedes Leviticus by centuries. The classification system already existed in the time of Noah. The text records Noah's exact age when the flood began. Genesis chapter 7, verse 6. 600 years. It is not a symbolic number in this context. It is integrated within a detailed chronology, with month and day. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. The 17th day of the 2nd month of the 600th year of Noah's life. The sources of water did not come from the sky alone. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 speaks of 2 simultaneous events. Fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The term Tehom Rabbah, great deep, refers to massive underground reservoirs. It was not just rain, it was a geological rupture. The rain lasted exactly 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis chapter 7, verse 12. But the waters prevailed over the earth 150 days. Genesis chapter 7, verse 24. Those are 2 distinct phases. The flood was not just precipitation, it was a sustained inundation of 5 months. The water level exceeded the highest mountains then known. Genesis chapter 7, verse 19. 15 cubits above them. Genesis chapter 7, verse 20. That is approximately 6.5 meters above the summits. Text asserts total coverage of the visible surface of the earth. God remembered Noah. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. The Hebrew verb zakar does not indicate that God had forgotten. It indicates the deliberate initiation of action in someone's favor. It is a legal and covenantal term. God activated the covenant he had established before the flood. Divine memory here is action, not passive recollection. God made a wind pass over the earth. Genesis chapter 8 verse 1. The Hebrew term is ruach, the same word used in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. When the Spirit moved over the waters of the original chaos, the flood and the creation share deliberate vocabulary. The text suggests a recreation of the world, not only a punishment. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis chapter 8 verse 4. Not on a specific peak, on a mountain range. Ararat in Hebrew corresponds to the historical territory of Urartu, a region that today spans eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran. Multiple archaeological expeditions have searched for physical remains in that area since the 19th century. American explorer James Bryce reported in 1876 having found worked timber at 4,000 meters of altitude on Mount Ararat. He could not verify its origin. In 1955, French aviator Fernand Navarra extracted dark wood fragments from a glacier. Carbon-14 tests produced inconsistent results among different laboratories. Noah sent a raven first. Genesis chapter 8 verse 7. The raven went out and did not return. Then he sent a dove. Genesis chapter 8 verse 8. The dove came back without finding anywhere to land. These are two distinct behaviors from two distinct birds. The text records real ethology. The raven feeds on carrion and can sustain itself on floating carcasses. The dove needs clean vegetation. The dove returned with an olive leaf in its beak. Genesis chapter 8 verse 11. The olive tree is notable for its ability to regrow under extreme conditions. Its presence indicated dry land and active vegetation. It was not a poetic sign. It was a precise botanical sign about the state of the terrain. Noah emerged from the ark on the first day of the first month of the 601st year of his life. Genesis chapter 8 verse 13. The land was already dry on the surface, but he waited until the 27th day of the second month. Genesis chapter 8 verse 14. He only came out when God commanded him. He did not act on his own initiative. Noah's obedience was complete to the very end. The first thing Noah did when he came out was build an altar. Genesis chapter 8 verse 20. He did not build a house first. He did not explore the territory. He built an altar and offered burnt offerings of every clean animal and every clean bird. That was his absolute priority. The smell of the sacrifice is described as a pleasing aroma to God. Genesis chapter 8 verse 21. The Hebrew word is nikoach, meaning rest or relief, the same root as the name Noah. The text deliberately connects the man to the sacrifice and to the divine response. God made a decision in that moment. He would never again curse the ground because of man. Genesis chapter 8 verse 21. Not because man had improved. The same verse acknowledges that the imagination of the human heart is evil from his youth. The covenant was not based on human merit. God then established a permanent cosmic order. Genesis chapter 8 verse 22. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. 4 guaranteed cycles as long as the earth remains. It is a structural promise about the stability of the physical world. In Genesis chapter 9 verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons. The words are nearly identical to Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It is a second commission. Noah receives the same mandate as Adam. Humanity begins again. A crucial difference from the original creation appears here. Genesis chapter 9 verse 3. God now authorizes eating animal meat. Adam was given only plants and fruits. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. The dietary regimen changes after the flood. Theologians debate whether the pre-flood world was fundamentally different in its ecological structure, but there is a specific restriction on meat. Genesis chapter 9, verse 4. They were not to eat meat with its life, that is, with its blood. This prohibition precedes the law of Moses by more than 8 centuries. It is a universal norm that predates the Hebrew people. The Apostle James reaffirmed it in Acts chapter 15, verse 29, for Gentile believers. Blood is bound to something deeper. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. It is the first explicit biblical foundation of criminal justice. The reason given is not social or cultural, it is theological. For God made man in his own image. God established a formal covenant with Noah. Genesis chapter 9, verse 9. The Hebrew term is berit, the same word used for the great covenants of Scripture, with Abraham, with Moses, with David. The Noahic covenant is the first in the series, and its scope is without precedent. The covenant extends to all living flesh. Genesis chapter 9, verse 10. Not only to human beings, also to birds, to beasts, and to all the animals of the ark. It is the only biblical covenant that explicitly includes the animal kingdom as part of the beneficiaries. The sign of the covenant was the rainbow. Genesis chapter 9, verse 13. The Hebrew word keshet means bow, like a warrior's bow. Some scholars note that the bow appears oriented toward the sky, as if God were setting down his weapon of war. The image is theologically dense. God himself declares that he will look at the bow and remember the covenant. Genesis chapter 9, verse 16. He does not say it for the benefit of human memory. He says it about his own action. The bow is a sign that God places for himself. That inversion of perspective is extraordinary in the text. The 3 sons of Noah are named again. Genesis chapter 9, verse 18. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And a detail is added. Ham was the father of Canaan. The mention is anticipatory. Something is about to happen that will directly involve that lineage and will have massive historical consequences. Noah planted a vineyard. Genesis chapter 9, verse 20. It is the first vineyard recorded in the Scriptures. He drank the wine, became drunk, and lay uncovered inside his tent. Genesis chapter 9, verse 21. The man who survived the most devastating judgment in human history falls inside his own tent. Ham saw his father's nakedness and went to tell his brothers outside. Genesis chapter 9, verse 22. The text does not elaborate further, but the phrase "to see the nakedness" in biblical Hebrew can imply something more than an accidental glance. Leviticus chapter 18 uses that same expression for prohibited relations. Shem and Japheth acted in the opposite way. Genesis chapter 9, verse 23. They took a garment, placed it on their shoulders, and walked in backward. They covered their father's nakedness without looking. The contrast with Ham is absolute.